Welcome to Define Roots. Today, I will introduce to a concept called steering the thoughts, our thoughts. And before I begin, I like to put a disclaimer that anything that is being said is to be like a fountain that you find in the forest. Some might be interesting and you may have a sip, whereas other things might not be so interesting and you might find it to be not interesting, and then you might take a dip. And the same thing goes with anything. If you're pleased, please stay. But if you're not pleased, then I'm sure there's other things to be found that could please you. So with that being said, let's dive into it. So the short version of this is a lot of times I have a lot of, like, once in a blue moon, there's going to be an intrusive thought that comes into play. And I don't intentionally want that thought, but it just pops up. Almost as if you were to open up a bottle that has the bubbles in them. When you open it up, suddenly there is bubbles that begin to fizz. And same thing with a lake. There's sometimes it is crystal clear, whereas other times it is not as clear and things from the bottom of the lake begins to surface. So the same thing goes with a thought. Sometimes there might be some disturbances on the bottom of the ocean or the lake, and it causes things to rise. And the problem is not that it rises. The problem is what we do with that. So when I get an intrusive thought, I can either, one, let that be the one that controls me, or two, I can control it. And the short version of this thought that comes up and how to navigate that is to, one, just let it be and focus on something else, and eventually that thought will settle, just like any emotion that comes up, and eventually over time it will settle. Anger comes up and eventually it'll fade away. Anger that is unattended can cause different problems, like you have hatred that begins to boil, and then you have things that becomes more sinister that is unattended anger. And the same thing with sadness. It can breed depression. It can breed a lot of different things if it is unattended. Just like if there was a leak in a pipe, if it is unattended, over time it'll begin to create a bigger gap, and eventually the problem will be seen as a bigger problem. But it was once just a tiny little crack on the wall or on the pipe, but over time it becomes destructive, and it can cause a lot of problems to the pipe, and you would have to replace it, you would have to repair it, and all sorts of things. So with that being said, I'll dive a little bit deeper into the concept of navigating the thoughts, because there's two different ways that the thought can become a reality. And the first way is that I identify with my thoughts. And at this point, you might ask yourself, if I am not my thought, then who am I? But before we get there, ask yourself this. If I am my thoughts, then why do I get random, intrusive thoughts? I don't intend to think about someone in a bad way. It just comes up. Like I would walk by a person and I would have like an intrusive thought. I'm sure we all have had that. Like I didn't intend to think bad about a person, but there's a word that pops up and I catch myself doing that. I'm like, yo, stop with that. That's not cool, and then I kind of brush it off and don't dwell on that. But it happens. And that is just the nature of things that happens within the mind and the body. For instance, arousal for men, it can be completely random at times. It's not even intended arousal, but it just happens. And same thing with emotions. Sometimes I just feel a strong sense of love, and sometimes I just feel a strong sense of just depression in a way, sadness, and kind of feel they just come up. I don't intend to sit and feel these certain things. It just comes up. So in the same way, there's going to be a lot of thoughts that are going to pop up. So one, I can identify with my thought, because if the thought is not me, then who am I? That's a different discussion, but the thought is not me because I don't intend to do those things, but it comes up naturally, just as natural as the heart is beating, and just as natural as I am breathing. It just happens automatically. But if I catch myself breathing shallow, I'm able to direct that action into a different action. And if I breathe very shallow, I can then take note of that and say, hey, I'm breathing very shallow right now. Let's take it up a notch. And so in the same way, when the thought pops up and then I realize, hey, this thought is intrusive. It's not the person that I am, and I don't feel like this is the thought that represents who I want to be and who I am. So from that point on, I don't identify with my thought. Now, two, I can steer my thought towards a different direction. And there's multiple ways to do this. One of the easiest, but also the hardest way, is to not think about it. Because when I say not think about it, naturally, we do think about it. But the easiest way to not think about something is to think about something else. An example is, if I get an intrusive thought, for instance, and I wouldn't sit there and think about that. I would notice that it is an intrusive thought, and I would carry on, like forgetting it, and then carry on doing something else. And that would be maybe watch a video, do something that gets my mind off that. And sometimes it is more difficult than other times. Sometimes it can just be a debris on top of a lake. You can just easily brush it off. Whereas other times, it is more than a debris, and it is rather a disturbance. And there's a lot of things that needs to be cleaned up. And in the same way, when it comes to things that surface, they also naturally settles if you don't touch it. there's no action that one can do to let the things on the surface of a lake settle. The more that we try to put our hands in and try to do things to let it settle, we realize that we begin to stir more things up. Therefore, when it comes to the thoughts and intrusive thoughts, it is best to leave it alone and let the body and the mind do its thing. And if you look at it in a different perspective, in a sense of my heart, it beats by itself. But if I try to beat it myself, I'm done. If I try to naturally and manually beat my heart, I wouldn't last. So there are certain things that happens in the way that they do, and it's meant to happen in the way that they do, and accepting that when intrusive thoughts comes, it is just a natural part of the human body and mind. It will come and it will go, just like everything else that exists in this world. And not holding on to any of the thoughts. And that could be, this could stretch out to say about the past, about the future, about anything, because attempting to hold on to certain things that have happened in the past can easily be detrimental as something that's attempted to hold on to something in the future. So the same way it goes with intrusive thoughts, it will come and go, and we just have to let it go. And that is essentially the navigating the thoughts. And the future and the past is for another video, but more so for this one. To sum it up, navigating the thoughts comes down to 2 points. 1, we can identify with the thought, and then it becomes real. But since the thought is not our intention to think of, then it is not ours. It just comes up. It could stem from a source of ours, but it's not our intention to think of those things. Just like as if there was an emotion that just came up, I could identify with anger and then decide to do something about anger. And that could go into many different directions, but rather, if anger comes up, realize and notice that there is anger, and eventually you will settle. And the same thing with a thought. Realize that the thought will come, and then it will go. So that is essentially the steering the thoughts, directing it in a way that it is more desirable, and take note and let things that are desirable be in the mind rather than things that aren't desirable in the mind. Kind of just push it to the side, and we kind of steer our way through the sea of thoughts. And sometimes there is an iceberg in front of us, and if we accept the faith that I'm going to crash into this iceberg, then that will be the faith. Or 2, you can just navigate around it. And same thing with our thoughts. It will come, it will pop up, and we can, 1, accept that it is our thoughts. I can't do anything about this. And then it is inevitable, then that will hit the iceberg. So there's a lot of metaphors, there's a lot of perceptions and visualizations. But essentially, navigating our thoughts and not let it navigate us. And that's going to be it for today's episode. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.